Introducing YouTube memberships, a fun way to support the channel while getting some exclusive perks. Click the join button to become a member now and get benefits like badges next to your name on videos, behind-the-scenes photos, advantages during the live trivia game, discounts on merchandise, private one-on-one video chats, the ability to request future video topics, and exclusive 8 to 10 minute videos on the history of the NFL. And now, on with our feature presentation. When dealing with a camp holdout, there's usually one of two ways to go about the situation. Option 1 is to negotiate with the player and give the player what he wants. Cave into his demands, give him what he's looking for, and get him into camp so he can integrate himself into the team and into the offense for the upcoming season. Option 2 is to play hardball and to not cave into his demands and to just let him hold out. At the end of the day, the player is the one who is missing out on money by not showing up. Let him continue to lose money and let him continue to jeopardize his bank account. And eventually, he'll show up. Those are the two ways that teams typically deal with holdouts. Try and get something done in the wake of a new contract or a revised contract, or do nothing and let the player eventually come to his senses and play under the agreed upon terms. However, in 1990, the Minnesota Vikings created a third option that, I've got to be honest, I didn't know existed. And they did so at kicker with this man right here. This is kicker Rich Karlis, and we'll talk about how good he was for the team in just a bit. But entering the 1990 season, he was looking for a new contract, seeing as the Vikings held his rights, but he wasn't technically under a contract agreement, because free agency was weird back then and was nothing like it is today. And to put the pressure on Karlis to come join the team and become their starting kicker again, they did something absolutely bizarre that, to be honest, I'm not sure there's any chance that something like this would work more than 3 decades later. You know that friend of yours that's bragging about how great of a girlfriend he has, but you never get the chance to meet her because she lives in another state or she lives somewhere in Canada? Yeah, the Vikings legitimately tried that in 1990. And the end result was rather hilarious, if I do say so myself. Because this is the story behind the absolutely hysterical and insane drama of the 1990 Minnesota Vikings. Before I talk about the actual controversy in question and what the Vikings tried to do, we need some context to understand who the kicker in question was that the Vikings were trying to re-sign in the first place. This man right here is Rich Karlis, and in 1989, he played an instrumental part in the success of the Vikings as they made it to the divisional round of the playoffs. Karlis spent the bulk of the 1980s with the Denver Broncos, and was one of the better kickers in the league for a good period of time. He was third in the NFL in field goal percentage by hitting over 84% of his kicks during the 1982 strike-shortened season, and followed that up with another great season in 1983, where he hit 84% of his kicks, ranking 4th in the league. He famously hit the game-winning field goal in overtime of the 1986 AFC Championship to give the Broncos a 23-20 victory to have them advance to Super Bowl 21. And by the time of his departure, he was the second leading scorer all-time in team history, only behind the legendary Jim Turner, who kicked in the 70s for the team, and who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, after a disappointing 1988 season, where he hit just 63.9% of his kicks, ranking just 22nd in the league out of 28 kickers, which was a far cry from his heyday during the first half of the 80s, when he was one of the most accurate men in football, and going just 13 for 25 on kicks of 30-plus yards or longer, which is obviously not going to get it done, especially at Mile High, the Broncos decided to go in a different direction. But his career would get a second win during that 1989 season when another team, the Minnesota Vikings, picked him up. And man, did he rebound nicely, having quite possibly the best year of his entire career, and reestablishing himself as one of the best kickers in the game. By the time the season ended, he hit 31 field goals, And keep in mind that he only joined the team starting in October, so he did this in 13 games. The 31 field goals led the entire NFL, and by a pretty good margin I might add, as no other kicker even made 30, and it made him the first Vikings kicker since Fred Cox all the way back in 1970 to lead the NFL in this category. And I feel incredibly comfortable in saying that there is no way whatsoever that the Vikings make the playoffs in 1989 and have the season that they do, going 10-6 and winning the NFC Central, if not for the play of Rich Karlis, because he was that valuable. Here are just some of the highlights. On November 5th, 1989, in Week 9 against the Los Angeles Rams, he tied an NFL record by hitting 7 field goals, going 7 for 7 in a 23-21 victory, which the Vikings won in overtime on the first ever overtime safety. You can learn more about that game by clicking the card in the upper right corner. On Christmas Day, in a must-win game against the Cincinnati Bengals, where in front of a national television audience on ABC on Monday Night Football, the winner would make the playoffs and the loser would go home, Karlis went 5 for 6, as the Vikings won 29-21, in a game that you can also learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And in Week 14, Karlis played a huge part in Minnesota's victory over the Atlanta Falcons, as he went an astounding 5 for 5. Even though the stats say that Karlis hit 79.5% of his kicks, which is still really good, seeing as that was 6th in the league, that's a bit misleading, because he started the season off very poorly, going 3 for 7 over his first 3 games. From November until the playoffs, so in those 9 games, there might not have been another kicker in football better than Karlis was, as he went 28 for 31 on field goals, hitting on over 90% of his kicks in that stretch. If your kicker was hitting over 70% of his kicks back in 1989, it was really good. And here was Karlis, when it mattered most, hitting 9 out of 10 tries. He was as reliable as they came, and the Vikings were absolutely expecting him to be their starting kicker in 1990. However, when it came to re-signing Karlis, seeing as the Vikings had his rights because of the way free agency worked back then, it was not exactly smooth sailing. Both sides obviously wanted to get a deal done. Karlis wanted to kick for the Vikings, and the Vikings, knowing the importance of a good kicker, wanted him back in the fold. But for whatever reason, the contract negotiations were incredibly rocky. Said Ron Grinker, who was Karlis' agent throughout the entire process, "We've made 3 different deals, and every time we've made them, they've changed their mind. Rich, General Manager Mike Lynn, and myself were on a conference call and had agreed to what we thought was a deal. But when we got the contract, it wasn't the same deal." It seemed as though the Vikings were engaging in somewhat shady business practices, changing the terms of the contract. And now, this negotiation was dragging on into August, well into training camp and the start of the preseason. Brinker continued, saying, "Apparently, Lynn's not worried about when Rich gets there. He's comfortable that Rich will be in good condition." But Saturday morning, Rich was packing his Jeep from Denver and getting ready to drive and head there. But we didn't receive the copies of the contract until Monday morning, and Mike told us not to leave until we received the copies. And once we did, the terms were not what we agreed to. It appears this will go on for a while now. It made sense why Karlis wanted a lot of money. He made $225,000 in 1989, which was a significant pay cut from what he was making before with the Broncos, and was definitely on the lower side of things from a contract perspective. He was seeking somewhere in the ballpark of $400,000, or nearly double his salary from the previous year, and the Vikings were not willing to give it to him at this moment. The holdout was continuing, and was showing no signs whatsoever of ending anytime soon. And that's when the Vikings and General Manager Mike Lynn tried to put the pressure on Karlis a bit more. What if we sign another kicker? We'll show him that he is replaceable, and we'll sign someone else to fill the spot. And if that guy does well, then maybe he takes over the job from Karlis, and he's straight out of luck. Or maybe the news of signing another kicker intimidates Karlis a little bit, and he decides to come to camp and get a deal done. And on the surface, obviously, nothing about this is unusual. If there's a holdout, this is a fairly common negotiation tactic, especially with a player on special teams. Sign another player at the same position and pressure the player holding out to come and give in. It's the same idea of hiring workers to fill your position when you go on strike. It's a perfectly common negotiation tactic, and it is a perfectly acceptable way of negotiating and dealing with a holdout. So by itself, this is not the bizarre part of the situation. However, you've probably got a very valid question. Who the heck is this kicker that they're signing? What's his name? What's his background? How old is he? How good is he? Where did he go to school? All of these are very valid questions to ask, and questions that anyone over the age of 4 would be asking. Well, and this is where it gets really weird and hysterical, we don't know. The Vikings agreed to terms with the kicker. The Vikings knew that signing another kicker to potentially take Karlis' spot and pressure him some more was the route that they were going to go. But when it came to actually revealing who this kicker was, General Manager Mike Lynn said absolutely nothing. We had to play Blue's Clues to figure out who it was. I'm not kidding. When Lynn was asked about who this kicker was, Lynn said, "It's a mystery. Call him 007. Alright, maybe Lynn's just playing a practical joke on all of us. Maybe Lynn's just messing with the reporters in the press conference, and we'll find out the guy's name when the transaction wire gets read the next day. Maybe I'm just blowing this one quote out of context." And trust me, if that was what Lynn said, and then we learned later on who the kicker was, then I wouldn't be making this video, and this would be a complete non-story. This would just be a general manager trying this tight 5. Except for the fact that during the team's preseason game against the New Orleans Saints, we still had no idea who this mystery man was. His name was still not revealed. Alright, maybe it's somewhere on the depth chart. Well, nope. That wasn't the case either. The man just showed up on the field, mysteriously in uniform. And in the game book, which is a detailed play-by-play account of what happens during the game, they listed the unidentified man kicking, or 007, as Rich Karlis. Seriously, Rich Karlis was kicking during this game, even though he was not on the team. And the real man kicking under the alias of Rich Karlis was a kicker who General Manager Mike Lynn called a mystery player. Are you confused? Oh, don't worry, it gets more confusing. Because to make matters even more confusing, eventually, we would figure out his name. Because of course, some members of the Vikings organization had to know who he was. And the team didn't even know his name. I wish I was making this up. Half the people who actually knew he was on the roster called him Dirt, as in D-E-R-T. The other half called him Dirk, as in D-I-R-K. So even among the people in the organization on the ends of this, they had no idea who he was. And making matters even more confusing, the man attempted one kickoff, which was the opening kick of the game, and then never appeared again, and got cut after the game was done. If that's not the most confusing plot in the world to try and convince Rich Karlis to sign a contract, I don't know what is. To be perfectly honest, I'm shocked that something like this was even legal. Sign a player, don't say who he is, don't reveal it to anyone, don't learn his name, have him just show up on the sideline for one play and one play only, and list him in the game book as a man who's not even playing. Okay, so who was this kicker in actuality? The mystery man, as we would later find out, was this man right here, Dork Borgononi. And that name might sound familiar if you know your kickers well. Borgononi was known for his absolute cannon of a leg, as the Pacific kicker held the high school record at Reno High School for the longest field goal in history, when he hit from 68 yards back in 1985. He eventually played a few games in 1995 with the Green Bay Packers, filling in on kickoff duties, but he didn't do much of anything in the pros outside of the 2 games he played with Green Bay. Still, he did make his mark as the mystery kicker for one play in 1990 for the Vikings, in one of the most bizarre sagas in team history. Oh, and for what it's worth, no, the Vikings and Rich Karlis could not come to an agreement. The holdout kept dragging on and went into September, and then the Vikings decided to go in a completely different direction, releasing Karlis. Karlis would find a home with this team behind him right here, the Detroit Lions, but he wouldn't really have quite the same success that he had in Minnesota. He went just 4 for 7 that season and got released midway through the year, and then never played again after the 1990 season. I'll give the Lions this much, though. At least when they signed him, we knew exactly who he was. So of all the ways to deal with a player holding out, this might be one of the stupidest ways to do so. And I do not say that lightly. If you are going to sign another player to pressure the player holding out to come back, go for it. Perfectly fine with that. But at the very least, don't do this. Disclose the player that you're signing, get his name right, and actually list the name on the depth chart and the game book. There are certain things that could never actually happen today in the NFL, and this is definitely one of them. Because in 1990, the Vikings signed a kicker, and they didn't even know his last name. And their mamas would be so ashamed. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.